for the support of these ventures is normally capitalized out of tax dollars. So when we build these facilities initially, when we do a significant upgrade, or when we decide to tear it down and rebuild a new one, or repurpose this one and move and rebuild a new one, all of those are always capitalized out of your local tax dollars. And so in those instances, I wouldn't say rare instances, they're rare in that they don't happen very often, but they're not rare in this arena. They do happen, and it's good to understand that. It's normally what transpires is when a new venue is due, for example, it's too old and too decrepit, and you realize there's just a point in time when putting more money into it just doesn't make sense. You'll own a car someday or an automobile, and eventually it'll have too many miles on it, and the transmission's wearing out, and the car has very little value, and it just doesn't make sense for you to put a new transmission in it and fix it up any longer. You'll eventually reach a point where it's time to transition to a different vehicle. Not necessarily a newer vehicle, but a different vehicle. The same is true for venues. Now, unlike our houses, what did we say about these types of venues? Unlike our houses. Yes, these things always go down in value. Unlike our personal properties, which always appreciate. That sounds like a great essay question. Yeah. So we know that they're decaying and becoming decrepit. They're aging. Their Wi-Fi 20 years ago has a hard time keeping up with today's fiber optics. The access for utilities, once you build underground utilities, it's kind of hard to dig them up and improve underground utilities. So when we build permanent structures, improving utilities is actually really hard to do without tearing it up and making a major mess, which we have done in the past, but the truth is, and so these venues are decaying, they're becoming aged, and we're doing everything we can to try to get as much life out of them, but eventually it gets to a point where we need a new one. So when we need a new one, we go back to the local taxpayers and we say, hey, we need to have a referendum over 10 years and raise your property taxes and sales taxes by, I don't know, 1%. Whatever that number is, the community organizers kind of, what's called do the actuarying. They kind of evaluate it and say, based on our tax base, if we over 10 years raise everybody's taxes by 1%, property tax, sales tax, we can generate another $350 million over the course of that time, which will pay for the bonds on a new facility. So then they go borrow money, $350 million, float the bonds are bought, and then they go to the taxpayers and they raise the taxes. Now, many times, depending upon the state and the local community, there has to be a vote on that, and the vote has to be approved. Not unanimously, just has to be a 51% approval. Actually, it's 50.01 to be honest with you. But for all intents and purposes, it needs to be a majority approve a referendum to actually raise our taxes. So in that case, many communities, not all, but many and most communities have the right to say yes or no to have our taxes raised, to put more money into sport ventures and venues, new ventures and new venues. And so then the money is either provided or afforded to the local community to redo by basically tearing this down or repurposing it, making it into a parking lot or whatever, and then going out and getting the bonds to get the new money to start the next project. Now, in some instances, those referendums can be turned down more often. It probably does behoove us to understand why that's the case. Can anybody guess why people might turn this down and vote no to something like this? It is. Who likes to have their taxes raised?
Nobody.
All right. So the minute you start talking about raising my taxes, people get soured on that. No matter what the benefit is. Okay, so that's the first reason. Why else might we vote that down or say no to that?
I feel like it's partial. Like a lot of people don't really care about that kind of certain thing, so that.
Okay, so not everybody's into funding sport.
Right.
If you're into fine arts, wouldn't you rather fund fine arts?
You would want
If you're into agriculture, wouldn't you rather see your money funding agriculture? And we can go on and on with that, yeah. So people's impressions is, if you force people to conform, they usually reject it. It's a classic understanding. You can't force all people into one way of thought. That's why there's certain progressive ideologies today that people just reject, whether it be CRT or I can name several others, gender dysphoria, dysfunction. I mean, it's pretty obvious none of you in here are 60 years old. Is anybody in here 60 years old? You can't choose your age. Yes, Doug thinks he's 60. The truth is, you're not, Doug. And no matter how hard you try to convince us, you can never choose your age. Yeah, nice try. So there are ideologies, and the truth is, if you force people to conform to something, they'll just reject it. And then when they see the reality, remember Dr. Fant, when the reality smacks you in the face, now that hurts. Yeah, so we can't force people just to pay more taxes to build a venue. They get the choice. So basically what the community organizers do is they go out and try to sell it, which is the right thing to do. They simply want to sell the ideal or ideology. And the idea is that, hey, if we build a new stadium, we'll create more jobs, and it creates more cash income, and it helps rebrand the city, and everybody gets to use it, and it looks really good for whatever city we're talking about, and you get to keep the team here. Well, all of those are great selling points. They may have some downsides to them, but it is there for community organizers and franchise organizers who kind of get together and say, hey, we got to sell it to the public because the referendum has to be approved. Now, unfortunately today, what we see in the current environment is, really in the last 15 or 20 years, is that most people, working class citizens, just don't have an appetite for raising their taxes. And if they get to vote on it, every time it gets voted down. So having that understanding, we have to then create some alternative funding routes to be able to fund these. Most cities today could use more health care. Most cities need more hospitals and more urgent cares and more nurses and doctors. Most cities need more first responders, fire and police and dog catchers and whatever. Most cities need more improved utilities. Our grid goes down constantly in local areas all around the country. Most cities need more. I could go on and on. Soup kitchens and shelters for the needy. So there's just so much need. Do we really need another sport venue? And the answer is no. The opinions of most public officials, they'd like to be able to sell that, but when there are so many other needs, the people that live in the local communities quickly realize, no, that's not the best use of our money. And so it's easy to say no to that. Now that decision is predicated on what's known as the best use of our resources. And you might have learned about this either earlier in this class or with Dr. Goulet, but it's called opportunity costs. You choose this door by saying no to those doors. So by choosing to fund a sport venue, you're actually saying no to hospitals and medicals and police and fire. Or by saying no to sport venue, you're actually taking what could be potential more monies and reallocating them to other community needs. So what you'll do personally and what we do professionally in the public arena is we will always assess the highest and best use of additional dollars. Now, people already don't like this, but if you put additional dollars on there and it's for first responders and it's for soup kitchens and it's for, if there's some issues there, you'd be surprised people are supportive of those kind of things because it affects the overall climate and environment. So as much as we like to always build new stadiums, arenas, and convention centers, new venues for our franchise owners, they don't always get their wishes. Now what's fascinating is when we do build them new facilities, their franchise values always go way up. So it's very self-serving for an owner to always want a new facility because they know they can always charge more for everything they do, and they know their franchise values always go up. So So these guys always work real hard to leverage their assets to get new stuff, more stuff, new stuff, more stuff. And these guys often try to put the brakes on that, because who pays for new stuff, more stuff? It's the public. So when you quickly realize that it's the public that is actually affording the opportunity for franchise owners to have more net worth and more net asset value, more money, then it is the poor and middle class who are transitioning and transferring their wealth to the rich elite and the uber elite. And none of us like that model, and that doesn't work for us. And so we don't want to see hard-earned tax dollars by plumbers and contractors and local people, school teachers, to be given to rich, wealthy business